Ok. C'est parti. Okay, well, good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody on Zoom. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm really happy to welcome you to the second day of this amazing workshop. And now I'm going to introduce you to the first speaker of this morning's session, who is Mirjam Ernestus. And Mirjam is a professor of psycholinguistics at Radboud Universiteit in Nijmegen. I may not have pronounced this correctly. Almost. In Nijmegen, in the Netherlands. And she is also the scientific director of the Center for Language Studies, a member of the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the chair of the editorial board of Radboud Universiteit Press. Her research focuses on how speakers produce and how listeners understand speech in informal conversations, more specifically, how they deal with reduced forms of words, something like probably for probably, and whether or how these variants are stored. And what's really interesting in this context is how second language listeners approach this task. So join me in welcoming Professor Mirjam Ernestus.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Isabel, for organizing this wonderful workshop. It's really inspiring. Just to warn you, I have a presentation with sounds, and those sounds do not always play on the right moment, so we'll see what happens. Okay, as you can see, the title of my talk is The Difficulty of Understanding Reduced Word Pronunciation Variants in a Foreign Language. And in order to make clear what I mean with reduced word pronunciation variants, I have a definition here. These are variants with fewer or weakly pronounced segments compared to the word citation forms. And I also brought some examples from English, French, and Dutch, as you can see here. What I will do is I will first play the sentence in which those pronunciation variants occur, which are brought with me today, so that you can hear that those sentences are perfectly natural. And then I will play the sounds by themselves without context, so that it's easier for you to focus on the pronunciation of those words. So the first are English, American English. And the first one is probably. I've already started playing. Again. Can you hear this? Maybe it should be a bit louder. So I think it sounds rather natural. And then in isolation it sounds like this. And this is a very common pronunciation of the word probably in American English. Then I have a sentence which contains both supposed to see and yesterday. And I will play it again.
We were supposed to see yesterday, but I felt really bad. We were supposed to see yesterday, but I felt really bad.
So supposed to see was pronounced like.
Just see.
And yesterday like.
Yesterday.
So as you can hear, some of the words had a smaller number of syllables. Other word combinations really were fused into smaller units. And yeah, that is what I call reduced word pronunciation variants. I also brought an example from French. This is a sentence that was recorded from a radio program. I don't know, so de la culture, so I don't know why it's skipping part of the sentence. So this is ministre in isolation. But there's very little that is still there. Then I brought a Dutch example in order to show that one single word can have many reduced word pronunciation variants. So I'm going to play you some of the pronunciation variants of the Dutch word natuurlijk, which means of course. And they're all spliced from a conversation of casual Dutch. Okay, so that is what this research, or my research, is about. You may think that this is a funny thing that doesn't occur, that happen, but it is not a funny thing. It is what is an important characteristic of conversational speech. So Johnson counted all the reductions occurring in the Buckeye corpus, and he found that in 25% of the words at least a single sound was missing, and in 6% of the words at least a single syllable was missing. So this is an important part of conversational speech. And it also means that if we would like to know what natural everyday speech is like, we have to pay attention to reduced pronunciation variants. And if we would like to know how people process them and listeners process them, everyday speech, we also have to pay attention to them. As you saw, reduced pronunciation variants are not restricted to English, because the same figures have been found for French and Dutch. Okay, now what about listeners? So I'm going to skip to listeners, and what we think is that reduced word pronunciation variants are unproblematic for native listeners. And the reason that we think this is, first, listeners are not aware of reduced pronunciation variants that they hear in the speech around them. They're not aware that they're producing reduced pronunciation variants themselves. So when I tell them about the topic of my research, the typical reaction is, well, I don't reduce. And then, I hear them reducing in the next sentence, typically. And another reason that we think that reduced pronunciation variants are, more or less unproblematic for native listeners is the results of experiments, of which I will present you two in a minute. In contrast, those reduced pronunciation variants are problematic for non-native listeners, which we have established in several experiments. And again, I will present you two of those experiments. The first one is an experiment that we run in Dutch with highly educated learners of Dutch who were enrolled in a course that would bring them from a B1 level to a B2 level. They were in the Netherlands, and they had a variety of native languages, and really many, many different languages, and also very different from Dutch. And we compared them, as Rachel recommended yesterday, with native speakers. So 23 highly educated native speakers of Dutch who also lived in the Netherlands, and they were mostly undergraduate students. What I did is I took a corpus of spontaneous speech in Dutch, and I selected 29 word tokens or word combinations. And you see here two of them, for instance, verkopen or bibliotheken. And these were all mildly to highly reduced, so a bit like the examples that I just gave to you. And they were all produced by the same speaker. Then we went back to this speaker, and we played those sentences with those reduced pronunciation variants that we were going to present to the listener, to this speaker, and we asked him to produce those sentences again, but then well or fully articulated, but at the same speech rate and with more or less the same intonation. And now you can hear what this sounded like. So I will first going to play for you the sentence as it was produced in the original conversation.
Voor de eind december stop. Voor de eind december stop.
And then when he produced it again, but then, it was more or less read aloud.
Voor 1 december stop. Voor 1 december stop.
So you can hear that the speech rate is more or less the same. Intonation was also more or less the same. But you can also hear that the speech rate was rather high, because this is what it was in this natural, casual speech.
Voor 1 december stop.
Sorry.
Voor 1 december stop.
So half of the participants of each group, the native listeners and the learners, heard the casual speech versions, and the other half of each group heard the read aloud versions. So this is what the participants saw in the experiment. So what they saw is Can you see a mouse? No. Okay, so what you see is there are these two lines, which is the orthographic transcription of the context. So people heard the whole sentence, but they could also read the context. So the context was also orthographically present. And as you can see, there were gaps in there, the horizontal lines, and it was the participant task to fill in there the words that were missing in the orthographic transcription. So they only had to give the target words that we were interested in. And what you can also see here, that there were sentences in which two target words were missing. But they were not dependent from each other. So it's not that there was a clear semantic relation between the two, so that if you couldn't recognize this, the first one, that you didn't have the right context to recognize the second one. The other thing, what you could see here on this screen, is that people had the possibility to listen to those sentences as often as they would like to. And you can imagine that when you're a learner, you need to do this, especially when there are several gaps in one sentence. Here are the results. So on the y-axis, you see the number of results, number of errors. And at the moment, you only see the results for the native listeners. In blue, the number of errors that the native listeners made for the full, so the read aloud version of the materials. And you see that they made hardly any errors. Well, that's what you would expect. And then for the reduced variants, you see a bit more errors. And then when I looked at the errors that were made, it was mostly in those sentences in which participants had to fill two gaps instead of one. So what they did is they only filled in one gap and then they continued with the next one. So what I think was going on, that this experiment was actually too boring and too uninteresting for our native listeners, and then you get this type of behavior with participants. Okay, so what about the learners? Here in blue, you see what they did with the read aloud versions, and you see that they made errors, which is not surprising because, as you heard, speech rate was rather high. It was in a context, so it was connected speech, and this may have all caused some kind of errors. What is more interesting now is what they did with the reduced pronunciation variants, and this is what they did. And you have to know that the number of errors that they could make, just by making errors for every possibility, have been close to 500. So you see that it's more than 50% of cases that they they just had no clue what was said. So at least this type of speech for people who are at a B1 level going to B2 is very difficult. You see a very big difference between the read aloud version, also at a high speed rate, and the reduced version. So what we see is that the reduced word pronunciation variants, ranging from mildly to severely reduced and presented in their context, are problematic for second language learners, B1, B2 level, with very different native languages. Okay, so we thought maybe we have to make the task easier. So that we try to see, what would happen if we would do that. So what we did is we tested more advanced learners, and we looked at schwa reduction in French. So what we have in French is that schwa, especially in the first syllable, can be absent in many words. So for instance, you can say pelouse, but you can also say pelouse, so without the schwa being present. And we tested those with Dutch advanced learners at the C1, C2 level. So in practice, that meant that these people had 6 years of courses of French at high school and were enrolled at the university program for at least a year. And what is also important to know that this type of schwa reduction should be easy for those Dutch learners because they are at a high level, because it is only schwa reduction, so it's very mildly reduced compared to the reductions that were present in the previous experiment, but also because schwa reduction also occurs in Dutch. So it's not exactly like a schwa reduction in French, where you can just apply it in every word, whenever you produce the word. In Dutch, you mostly reduce words when they're in the middle of sentences and in the middle of conversations. But also then, schwa can be completely absent. So the Dutch should be, familiar with this type of reduction. So we thought, we have created all the conditions to make this easier, easy for our Dutch listeners. So what we had, our target words were 44 nouns with a schwa in the first syllable, and that schwa was present or not. And it was preceded with a determiner, so the definite determiner le or la. And I'm going to play you 2 examples, which is not of the word pelouse as indicated here, but of the word besogne. So you can hear that the schwa is clearly present, and in reduced version. Yeah, so it is really mildly reduced. There is one complication, however, and that is in 38 cases out of 44, the absence of a schwa results in an illegal consonant cluster. And then what often happens is that you get resyllabification. So the first consonant of the word is resyllabified with the determiner. So in the case of le renard, if that is reduced, you don't get le renard, but you get something like le renard. And that makes things a bit more complex. So we had a lexical decision experiment, and there were lots of fillers there, so that the number of words with a schwa is more or less similar to the normal number of words with schwa that you run into conversations. Okay, so we had 2 participants groups, native listeners and Dutch advanced learners, and what you see here are the results for the native listeners. So on the y-axis you see the accuracy in percentages, and the black bar is for the words in which the schwa was fully present, and you see that there was almost 100% accuracy. And that is what we expected, because also notice that these were words that our learners knew, so these were rather easy words. Then you see that the accuracy for the gray bar is a bit lower, but it is still rather high. It's almost 90%. Nevertheless, we were a bit surprised that native listeners didn't do better. And what we think that happened is that maybe the native listeners have been a bit surprised to find those reduced pronunciation variants in lab conditions. You know, they were in a soundproof booth. It was a very formal condition, and then words in isolation. And this might have been the reason that they were a bit confused and therefore didn't score, maximally. Okay, but in general, I think that this shows that native listeners can do well with reduced pronunciation variants. Now, what about our advanced listeners? You can see that they did also rather well with the forms when the schwa was present. So indeed, they were advanced learners. And this is what they did with the reduced pronunciation variants. So that is, again, much worse than the native listeners did. So the difference between the full and the reduced forms, much bigger for the learners than for the native listeners. And notice again, these are really advanced learners. So they have had many years of French at school. They opted to go to university to become fully proficient in French. So I guess that they also have been in France before and have been involved in spontaneous conversations. And nevertheless, you see the results. Okay, so what we can conclude is that reduced word pronunciation variants are problematic for non-native listeners, more or less, independently of the listener's proficiency, the listener's native language, the type of reduction, and the presence or absence of context. And then the big question is, of course, why? And I'm going to discuss with you 2 possible causes. And the first one is not really linked to the topic of this workshop, so I will discuss it only very shortly, but I thought I have to discuss this in order to give you a more or less full picture of what I think is going on. And it is that I think that depending on your native language, you may show low sensitivity to acoustic cues that may be important in order to understand reduced pronunciation variants. This is a study that we conducted in English. And what we did is we came up with non-words that are very similar to real words with a schwa in the first syllable, and of which the schwa can be easily reduced. So here you see the example suppose, which is very close to suppose, and suppose can be produced without the schwa. Is also often produced without the schwa, like suppose. What we did is we made a continuum for these words, so a continuum with a schwa of 0 milliseconds to 48 milliseconds in 8 steps, And we presented them first to British native listeners to see what they did with this continuum. And then the question was, how much of a schwa do native listeners need in order to perceive the schwa? So participants' task was to say whether they thought that it was a monosyllabic word or a disyllabic word. And what you see on the y-axis is the percentages of bisyllabic word responses. And here you see the results for the British native listeners. So until 12 milliseconds, they tend to say that the word is monosyllabic. And once the duration of the schwa increases, you see that also the number of bisyllabic responses increases. And then around 30 milliseconds, you can still lengthen the schwa, but it doesn't make a difference anymore. So then everybody thinks that this is just bisyllabic, 30 milliseconds. We did the same experiment with Dutch university students who did not study English, so they're just normal undergraduates. And what you see is more or less the same curve. And that is also what we expected because, as I just explained to you, Dutch native listeners are familiar with schwa reduction as well. So they are as sensitive to short versions of schwa as British native listeners. Then we also run the experiment with Spanish learners of English. So these were students of English at the university. And they are different from the Dutch and the English listeners in the sense that they don't have so much experience with schwa reduction. Because officially there's no schwa in Spanish, at least in most variants. And what you see is that vowels are reduced much less than consonants in Spanish. So also in that sense, they are not really familiar with schwa reduction. And this is what we see. So the red line that you see here is the curve for the Spanish learners. No, the blue line, sorry. The blue line is the line for the Spanish learners. And as you can see, there's just much more guessing going on. And even with a duration of 48 milliseconds, then only 60% of tokens receive a bisyllabic answer. So that means that even if there is a schwa of 48 milliseconds, in 60% of cases, Spanish learners of English won't notice that schwa at all. And of course, that also makes it much harder for them to recognize the reduced pronunciation variants. So that is one possible cause for why learners have problems understanding reduced pronunciation variants. Then the other cause that I would like to discuss, and that is more linked to the topic of this workshop, is the strength of the lexical representations, as indicated by the frequency of occurrence of the word. So, as you probably know, there is lots of research that has shown that the more often a word occurs, the easier it is processed by listeners. So if a word is of a higher frequency, people are faster in recognizing the word, and they make fewer errors with recognizing the word. And the common interpretation is that the lexical representations of those words are more easily accessible and therefore stronger. Well, rather recent research has shown that the same holds for word pronunciation variants and native listeners. So word pronunciation variants of a higher frequency are processed more easily, so faster and also with fewer errors. And the way that this is normally interpreted is that, also those pronunciation variants for which the frequency effects are found are also stored in the mental lexicon. And this also implies that apparently our mental lexicon would contain many variants, or can contain many variants of words. And the lexical representations of more frequent variants are more easily accessible. Okay, now if we think about learners, what we know about learners, if they just attend courses, that they don't hear reduced word pronunciation variants very often. So the materials that are recorded to play during courses typically do not contain reduced pronunciation variants or the standardized ones like don't or won't in English, but not the natural ones like yesterday or see for supposed to see. And if you talk to the teachers, they also say that they try to articulate well when talking with their students. So learners who are just enrolled in courses do not have much experience with reduced pronunciation variance. Well, then the question arises, given that we know that frequency of higher frequency of occurrence results in stronger lexical representation. Is it maybe the case that non-natives have more problems with reduced word pronunciation variance simply because they have little experience with them? And if so, then you would expect that these problems disappear if those learners are trained on reduced word pronunciation variance. So that is what we have investigated in an experiment, which I will only discuss with you half of it to keep it, So what we did is we tested 120 Dutch beginner learners of French. And we taught them 24 real words in French with schwa in the first syllable. And I have to say that these are beginning learners in the sense that they were learning French, or they had learned French at school for 3 or 4 years, 2 or 3 hours a week. But they are still really beginners. But they know something about the language. So we taught them 24 words with schwa in the first syllable that we knew or that they would not know, because these words do not occur in those books for those beginning learners. And we also taught them 20 other words that we expected them to already know, because they're really the beginning words and they also occur in the textbooks. And of course, we also added those 20 other words to hide that this was all about schwa words, and they were words that they already knew, just to make their learning task much easier. Because learning 24 words is already difficult, learning 48 words is not going to work. Those beginning learners heard every word 10 times in total. So the way this worked is that they first saw a picture, then they heard the Dutch word, and then later on they would see the same picture again, and they would hear 4 tokens of the French word. And then they would see 2 pictures, and they heard a word, and they had to click on the picture they thought was the right picture, and then the number of pictures increased until the participant had heard the word 10 times in total. Then we tested those people with a lexical decision experiment, in which the newly learned words were mixed with real words that they already knew because they were in the textbooks, or because they were cognates of Dutch words, and of course with pseudo words. So we had 120 participants, and we divided them in 3 groups. So there was one group who only heard the reduced pronunciation variants of the words. There was the full variant group, which only heard the full variants. And there was a group which heard both variants of the words. So they would hear 5 tokens of the reduced form and 5 tokens of the full variant. And again, I would like to remind you that these were Dutch learners of French, so they should be familiar with schwa reduction. And so the hypothesis is that if it is really the case that if learners learn reduced pronunciation variants and have therefore strong lexical representations for reduced pronunciation variants, then they should do well. And therefore we would expect that the reduced variant group and the both variant group would not show difficulties with reduced pronunciation variants in this experiment. Okay, but first we are going to have a look at what the full variant group did. So what you see on the y-axis is accuracy, again in percentage, and the gray bar is the accuracy score for the reduced pronunciation variance, and the black bar is the score for the full pronunciation variance. And as you can see, the black bar is rather high, which shows that people were able to recognize the words that they were trained on. And you see that the bar for the reduced pronunciation variance is rather low. Well, actually, what you see here is what we typically see with beginning learners. You know, they're only presented with full pronunciation variants, so they do well on the full pronunciation variants. They don't hear reduced pronunciation variants, and they don't do well with reduced pronunciation variants. And you might be surprised that our Dutch learners still had a rather high score of 30% for the reduced pronunciation variants. But this, of course, may have something to do with the fact that they are familiar with schwa reduction from their native language. Here are the results for the people who were trained only on the reduced pronunciation variants, and you see the mirror picture. So those people were especially good, well, at the forms they were trained on the reduced pronunciation variants, and they were not that good on the full forms on which they were not trained. So learners are good on the forms they are trained on, that's it. And again, you see that, you know, the score wasn't very, very low for the full forms on which they were not trained. But this is again probably because the Dutch learners are familiar with schwa reduction. So they know that you can reconstruct full forms, especially when they're illegal consonant clusters, by inserting a schwa, because that is what you do in Dutch as well. And then here are the results for the both exposed group. And as you can see, you know, they were trained on both forms, and they did well on both forms, and they did equally well on both forms. So what we see is that learners recognize word variants more quickly that are more frequent for them. And so if they are trained on reduced pronunciation variants, then they do well on reduced pronunciation variants. Okay, but they normally are not. And then the question arises, okay, given that they have those problems, because they're not that sensitive to acoustic cues and because the lexical representations are not that strong, do these problems lead to different processing strategies? And with processing strategies, I'm going to focus today on the use of exemplars and abstract lexical representations. What I'm going to assume here is a hybrid mental lexicon in which the pronunciation of a word is stored in the form of a string of abstract units, like phonemes, as you can see here for the English word cathedral. In addition, there is a cloud of exemplars, and an exemplar is a token that a listener has heard, and that the token is stored together with all the acoustic detail. So specifics about the voice, about the intonation, about weakening of segments or reduction, everything that can be present in the acoustic signal. And then you might wonder why I would assume exemplars, and that is because there is lots of literature that shows that exemplars may play a role in speech processing. And I'm just going to repeat this literature to fresh up your memory. So the evidence for exemplars comes from long-term priming experiments, identity priming experiments. In those long-term priming experiments, people hear a series of words, like you see here: cathedral, tree, hotel, boy, bus, cathedral. And in some of those words are repeated. And what we typically see is that people react more quickly on the second token than on the first token. And that's because the first token primes the second token. Now, in those exemplar experiments, there is a manipulation in the sense that some words are produced by one speaker and other words are produced by a second speaker. So I have two speakers here, a green speaker and a black speaker. And as you can see, in the first series, the word cathedral was twice pronounced by the same speaker, the green speaker. And in the second series, the first token of cathedral was produced by the green speaker and the second one by the black speaker. And what we see now is that if the word was twice produced by the same speaker, participants react more quickly than if the second token was spoken by a different voice. Now, the idea is that it is evidence that people have stored all the acoustic characteristics of the first token, including the characteristics of the voice. And that is why people assume that there are exemplars, or also exemplars in addition to abstract lexical representations. Now, what we investigated is whether natives and non-native listeners differ in how much they rely on exemplars. And an additional manipulation that we have is whether this depends on the presence of reduction. So our first experiment is very similar to the experiment that I just presented to you with the cathedral in there. We had 40 native listeners of English and 2 groups of non-native listeners, both at the B2 level. And there were native speakers of Dutch and native speakers of Spanish. So it was a lexical decision experiment. People had to say whether it was a real word in English or not, and we manipulated the speaker voice. So whether the second token was pronounced in the same voice as the first one. And our speakers were really different. One was a male speaker, the other was a female speaker. So yeah, no way to not to notice this, I would say. The experiment had 2 parts for us. But for the participants, it was just one experiment. So part 1 just continued with part 2 without any break. In the first part, there were 30 target words and 30 pseudo words. So people said whether they were real words or not. And then in part 2, those words all occurred again. So the second tokens. But we also intermixed some distractors, so that not all words were repeated in the second part. And all 3 groups of participants did rather well, as you can see, very few errors. Here you see the results for the native listeners. So the reaction times on the y-axis, the gray bar shows the reaction times for when there is a speaker match, and the black bar is for when there was a speaker mismatch. And you see that people were slower to respond when the second token was produced in a different voice than when it was produced in the same voice. So this is exactly the old replication of the exemplar effects. So this is exactly what we expected, voice manipulation with native speakers. Okay. But now the question is, what did the Dutch and the Spanish listeners do? Well, there are 2 things that you can see here. First, the Dutch and the Spanish listeners took much more time to do this experiment, so the reaction times are much longer, and that is because lexical decision is probably a much more difficult task for learners than for native listeners. Because those lexical representations are not that strong and might also be fuzzy. The other thing what you will see is that for both the Dutch and the Spanish listeners, there is no exemplar effect at all. So only the native listeners show as an exemplar effect here. What we think is going on here is that the learners don't show an exemplar effect because they don't have the cognitive resources left to both consult the exemplars and the abstract lexical representations. And the reason that we think that they don't have cognitive resources left is that because the task is rather difficult, as you can see in the long reaction times. But the other reason that we think this is that it has been observed before for native listeners that their exemplar effects are smaller when they have an experiment with moderately challenging conditions. So also for native listeners, we know that when processing is more difficult, more demanding, then the exemplar effects disappear. So that, I think, is a plausible explanation for why we find that the non-native listeners don't show an exemplar effect. Then the second experiment, in which we did not manipulate voice, but we manipulate the pronunciation variant of the word. So again, we had English, Dutch, and Spanish native listeners, again at the B2 level. And so the variation is now whether the schwa, because these were all schwa words, our target words, were reduced or not. So whether the first schwa was reduced. So we had words like police, and we had words like please. And again, schwa reduction is familiar to the Dutch learners, but not to the Spanish learners. Again, 2 parts, which are actually the same as in the first experiment. And again, we see that participants could do this experiment rather well, few errors. Okay, here are the results. Now we no longer see an exemplar effect for the native listeners. So why? So we thought, well, probably this also has something to do with cognitive load, because they are listening to words that are reduced. And that is not something that you would expect in a lab. And if, say, plus is already difficult for French learners, even though also in isolation you can reduce pelouse to plus, it will be even more difficult for English listeners because schwa reduction doesn't occur in isolation that often in English. So maybe that is the reason that they also have a higher cognitive load than normally and therefore do not show an exemplar effect. Here you see what the Dutch did, and they also don't show an exemplar effect. The difference is not statistically significant, and so what we think is that there was an increase of cognitive load because of the reduction, but the increase was not tremendously because, they're used to schwa reduction. Here's what the Spanish do. First you see that the reaction times are really long, but you also see that there is a real exemplar effect now. So when participants heard the second variant, if they heard a word in the same variant, they were much quicker to recognize it than if they heard the second token in a different variant. So what's going on here? So, we can't say, if we would like to stick to our explanation of cognitive load, and actually that is what we would like to, we have to think that if the cognitive load becomes really high, then in a condition where people have to do lexical decision and where words are repeated, it might actually be easier to use the exemplars to heavily rely on the abstract lexical representation. So what we think is that if there is repetition and the cognitive load is really, really high, then people might more rely on exemplars. And if this is correct, and I would happy to hear what you think about it and if you have alternative hypotheses, but it would mean that if you have a low cognitive load, you use both exemplars and abstract lexical representations, then when the load is getting a bit higher, you concentrate on the abstract lexical representation, which I think is a wise thing to do if you have to interpret words. But then if it gets really, really high, this cognitive load, and you have noticed that there is repetition, that then you run into using mostly the exemplars, maybe at the cost of using abstract lexical representations. It's a hypothesis, and it clearly needs more investigation. Okay, so, but at least what we can decide on the basis of these results is that natives and non-natives differ in their reliance on abstract lexical representations and exemplars. And this is true for full and for reduced word pronunciation variants. And we guess that the underlying reason is the amount of cognitive load that is present, so the availability of cognitive resources. This brings me to the wrap-up of this talk. What I have shown is that highly word pronunciation variants are very, very frequent in everyday speech, but they are difficult to understand for learners. So this is a real problem for learners if they really would like to interact with native listeners. There are at least two main sources for these difficulties: unfamiliarity with the non-native phonetics and unfamiliarity with the reduced variants themselves. And this unfamiliarity may result in a different use of exemplar versus abstract lexical representations, which may have its consequences as well. Now, what is a bit contradicting, I think, in this whole talk is that I'm discussing a phenomenon that occurs in everyday speech in context, but many, not all, but many of the experiments in which I tested how learners cope with reduced pronunciation variants is by making them do unnatural tasks, like lexical decision, and by presenting the words in isolation. Well, it's not true for all my research, but it is true for much of the research that is done also in my lab. So what I would strongly plea for is that future research should investigate listeners' processing within the context of everyday speech tasks to obtain a fuller picture of what people are really doing in everyday interactions. Okay, then my final slide, on which I would like to thank my collaborators. And I would especially like to thank the two collaborators on the left, which is Kilene Giesenaar, who helps me with doing all the experiments in Dutch, because he's a Dutch teacher and I know nothing about teaching Dutch to foreign learners. And the other person is Louis ten Bos, who helps me supervising the PhD students. Thank you.